Hello, friends, and welcome to Little Giant Crafts. Today's craft was a long time in the making. For a bit of backstory, growing up, I had always been interested in D&D, but never actually played because I didn't know anyone who played, and I, didn't have it in me to learn all the rules by myself and convince other people to play. But in college, I met a good friend named Liz who has been playing games all her life. She volunteered to run a game for us. And I thought it was going to be a one-off thing, but it has been a continued campaign that I'm so happy we're playing. Of course, a year and a half ago or whatever, everyone started quarantining, we couldn't play in person anymore. So we kept on playing online on Zoom, but it was fine, but it just wasn't the same. Finally, once, vaccines started to roll out and we were all getting vaccinated and I knew we'd be able to play in person again, I wanted to do something special to celebrate. To explain what I'm making, I have to tell you a little bit about our story. Not our story, but we entered this town, our characters, and there was this big, crazy house owned by a wizard named Yalvin. He didn't seem to quite know what was going on. He wasn't all with it, but whatever. We bought some potions or whatever and left. We get to another town, and there's another big, crazy house. We go inside, and there's Yalvin again. And we end up finding his house in every town we go to, and he's never quite sure when or where he is. So there's some sort of weird spatial temporal business going on there. But the character was created by our DM, and it's one of our favorite features. We always love seeing his house in any town we go to, and it's such a unique design, I thought I had to build it. And I may have bit off a little more than I could chew. This is definitely my most complicated project to date. Maybe the biggest finished project, at least. I've got a few things I've started working on before that are a little bigger, but this is my biggest finished project, and it took me about a month and a half. But before I keep rambling, let's just get crafting. The idea for this build comes from our GM herself. She's described the house as 3 stories, but not a normal 3-story house, looking kind of like 3 buildings were just sort of dropped on top of each other at weird angles. Very brightly colored, predominantly yellow. I asked her for a little more description, and she said it was mainly Tudor architecture, and what most of the pictures of Tudor-style houses I could find have in common is these, visible wooden supports. I also found some other pictures later on that this one in particular is, I think it said San Francisco maybe. It's like a Victorian era or like inspired house, but like just all the little bits and bobs and like the decorative things on it I really like. So I'm going to try to incorporate some of that as well. Oh, and she also cited layer cakes as an inspiration. Obviously, you can see the, multiple layers, weird angles, so that's definitely the vibe I wanted to go for. It's really open-ended, so a lot of it was up to my interpretation, so let's get to the plan. So you can see here I start with just a handful of reference images to make sure I'm sticking to the right vibe. And then really, I'm just sort of playing with, different shapes, maybe a chimney, maybe a roof. I'm taking some elements from this picture specifically, like this little part that juts forward. And obviously I want to get all the, wooden, structural bits. I quickly realized while doing this that the wonky, off-kilter nature of the stories made the roof kind of a question. So my initial idea here was to sort of have like a low sloping roof. And then I decided, maybe I should have a door up here. And then that kind of turned into a patio on the next floor, a railing. And like, even when I was drawing this, I knew I wasn't going to follow it exactly. This was more just, the ideas, some towers, a telescope, a flamingo, because I already knew early on I wanted to have like some anachronistic touches, like things that don't belong in the medieval period, because, there's something weird time-wise going on with him, so I thought that would be a fun little way to illustrate it. And then I knew the building would be primarily yellow, but I wasn't really sure on everything else, so I was like, for now, I'll just do the roofs orange, because, it's next to yellow on the color wheel, similar color, so it'll blend, probably. And then I just draw in a lot more of those wooden structures. And then I had a few little other touches of color, but that's sort of my idea going into the build. To start this build, I basically looked around at what I had and grabbed a handful of boxes of different shapes and sizes and just sort of, played around with looks and what would, approximate the drawing. And I ended up with these here. Now the base is a shoebox, which was a good size but pretty flimsy, so I ended up reinforcing it with a lot of other cardboard, just gluing it to the walls and just adding some structural supports. And then in between the cardboard I also add newspaper stuffing just to make it more secure. I also took the corners from cardboard packaging and used those to cover up the box corners. Since they've already got the fold built in, it works to cover up the seams that will be on any corners. I have 2 identical boxes of filament for 3D printing, so I decided to glue those together and make one larger box. And I just put some cardboard around the outside to cover up the seams. I roughly play around with the boxes until I find a design I like, and then I trace it on the roof of the first box, so that way I'll have a guide to follow later. And then I just get working on the first floor. For all of the wooden structural bits that make the Tudor style, I am just going to be using pretty much popsicle sticks glued on. So I have one as a guide to trace, and I just start going around the box, again looking at reference pictures and just marking out all the places I'm going to be gluing sticks. And once I'm happy with each wall, each side of the building, I glue the sticks on. I've also got much smaller sticks. I'm not sure what they're normally used for. I think they're literally just sold as like small crafting sticks. They're about the size of matchsticks, actually. I use them for the window frames. Again, I just mark out where they're going to be and just cut them to size and glue them on. So then I'm getting started on the second floor, and since boxes are flat, but these buildings are going to be at an angle, I need to extend the bottom a little bit. So basically, I decide on an angle I like, and then I mentioned covering up the seam in these 2 glued together boxes. Well, on 2 of the sides, I do the same thing, but instead of just, a square that covers the boxes, they extend down, making that raised angle. And then I cut out a bunch of other triangles out of foam and cardboard, whatever I had at hand, just to help support it and hold it up. I decide since the roof situation is kind of weird, I'm just going to have like some sides will have a roof and some won't, and it'll just be different sizes and covering up what's there. So I just sort of play around till I get a size I want, and then glue down a rectangle to be the bottom of the roof, and then cut out, once again, a bunch of triangles, and that'll be the angle that the roof is at. And then I glue another piece of cardboard on top. And I do that in a few spots. And then once I'm done with that, it is back to the popsicle sticks, marking where I want them and gluing them on. Now, gluing wood to cardboard, you could use tacky glue or wood glue, but it would take a while to set, so I decided to use hot glue so that I wouldn't be sitting here forever waiting for each one to dry. Then before I put the smallest box on top, I decided I wanted to have
like almost a mini tower under it, basically just a smaller structure. So I just made that out of chipboard. Instead of 2 rectangles, I cut out 2 quadrilaterals, I guess, with a matching angle on the bottom. So that way, once I put it on the building, it would also be at an angle. And this one, I didn't want angles that matched and sort of amplified like the shape of a wave. I wanted them to be different directions, so it was still sort of upright like a building. So I just rotated that. But yeah, I glued some more triangles in the corners to strengthen it, stuffed it with newspaper, and then I glued the other box on top of that. Then I decided the main walking area would be on top of the second floor, but I wanted it to be a little bigger, so I decided to make a deck. All I did for that was decide on the size I wanted it, and then cut out that shape a few times from foam board and glue them together. And then while I had the foam board, I also cut out a few squares to fit in the gaps of the wood and make a brick wall. And all I did is draw on it with a marker, and the marker carves into the foam a little bit without tearing it, which is important when you're working with foam. And then when it gets painted over later, you'll be able to see the impressions and in the three-dimensionality of it. But that's much easier than doing individual bricks, which we'll get to. I said we'll get to it later, but we'll get to it now. So I wanted a tower, and I decided to use a Pringles can. And I had just watched a video by Immersive Terrain in which he uses corkboard to make the bricks. I mean, I was thinking of doing individual bricks to begin with, but I was thinking probably foam board. But when I saw this video, I thought, I've got a lot of corkboard at hand. Let me try something new. So I have no idea how many hours cutting bricks. And once that was done, so after I stuffed the can with newspaper, like usual, I marked out where I wanted some windows and doors, because obviously in that sort of tower, the windows and doors are just, spaces where the bricks don't go, so I can't put bricks there. And once that's done, I start gluing the bricks on, which takes forever. No, it maybe took like 3 days of work. Obviously not like 72 hours straight, but like for 3 days, this was basically all I did. I will say though, for the unnecessary amount of work it took, I am really happy with the results. It definitely looks cool and is pretty much worth it. So I just started doing a ring around the bottom and going up one layer at a time, and then whenever I got to a door or a window, I would just stop and do the frame first, and then I would go back to the rings. And eventually, finally, that was done. And I just had a 3D printed roof lying around from another project that I ended up using because it was about the same size as the Pringles can, so that worked out well, and I just glued that on top. After that, I moved on to the next roof, and like I mentioned, wanting to do little, anachronistic things, I decided this one would be a red clay tile roof. But I realized that straws were basically the right shape and size. So first I took a bunch of those little matchsticks and I glued them on, because that way, since obviously straws are hollow, I wanted them to have something solid to sit on top of. And then I cut the straw in half, so I had, instead of a tube, 2 half circles, and I cut those into little tiles. And then I just started gluing them on, starting from the bottom. You got to remember with tiles, you want to start from the bottom because, the way they're layered, if you started at the top, it wouldn't work. Now, I wasn't sure how this was going to turn out since I'd never done it before, but I'm actually really happy with how it turned out. For this specific kind of tile, the straws worked really well. Around this point, I also started marking out where the boards would go on the top 2 layers. And then I get started with doors. I basically just, I've been using a template on the building itself, so I just take that and I cut out some pieces of cardboard and I glue, again, strips of thin popsicle stick to it, and then I just glue little beads for the doors. I also use bread clips for the hinges on one of the doors because One side I decided would have double doors, and I wanted something to sort of differentiate the two sides. And they look like, I just cut off the ends and, trimmed them a little bit, and they look like decorative sort of iron hinges. And then another thing I also did on some of them was I just used drops of tacky glue to make rivets. It's pretty subtle, but it dries more or less solid. And then once it dries, you've got little round rivets or nails or whatever they are. Then I'm just gluing more popsicle sticks. Obviously, you may have noticed, popsicle sticks have rounded edges. The wood on Tudor-style architecture does not. There was a lot of cutting and trimming and snipping the edges of popsicle sticks off, which left me with a lot of little wooden half circles. I mentioned this picture earlier, and one of the things it inspired me to do was have a wall with curved shingles. So I took all those little snipped off popsicle stick ends and I started gluing them onto this wall to make a little set of shingles. This was also kind of tedious, mostly because the box on top has an overhang, so it was kind of hard to get my hand in there at a few points, but overall it wasn't too bad. I decided in front of this shingled wall I wanted a little Zen garden because, again, clashing styles and whatnot. But since it was at an angle, I thought that would be weird because the point of a Zen garden is to rake the sand and make it all nice and stuff. If it was on an angle, it probably wouldn't sit very well. So I just added a little triangular spacer to raise that bit back up to flat, and I just, put another piece of cardboard on top of that to make the bottom of it. Then I glue the tower in place. It's also time to start thinking about the actual roof, the top roof. So I draw out the shape I want from cardboard and I glue it on to two of the sides, and that will be the, foundation of the roof. And I had decided I wanted a little walkway leading to the top door. So I just make that the same way I made the doors. I glue popsicle sticks to the shape I want. And I put little matchsticks under it to be like supports. And then another inspiration I took from this weird house is the front door porch area. I wanted that sort of little overhang with the columns. We get rolls of dog waste bags, and these tubes are in the center of it, the same way like toilet paper works. But instead of being paper, these are plastic, so they're nice and sturdy. So I use those as the columns, and then I, put a piece of cardboard on top, and then some triangle pieces for the roof shape. And then for the front piece, I actually just, threw together some models I found online to make something that looked more or less similar style, because I wasn't sure how else to make it. Then it's back to the roof, and I glue a piece of foam between the two to hold it together. Obviously that will be where the two sides of the roof meet. And instead of leaving it straight, I try to carve a bit off to make it sort of curved, because I think that will just, give it a little more character. And then I glue triangles that will make that same shape to hold up the roof, and I glue those in. And then I, figure out the size and shape I want for the roof, cut that out of cardboard and glue it on. Now you'll notice the roof is asymmetrical. One side juts out with this big point. I realized I wanted it pointing in one direction, and I accidentally glued the pieces on backwards so they were pointing in the other direction. I was initially frustrated, but I realized I could literally just cut those parts off and glue them back on the other side, so that's what I did. One little bit that I like to save is these, I don't know what you call them, but when you open a new carton of milk or juice, it's like the little pull tab under the cap. And I don't know specifically what drink these were from, but I have two that sort of look, at least to me, like almost like a nautical window with like thick frames. So I snip the ring off of them and glue them onto two bottle caps, and they're going to be windows that sort of like jut out from the wall. Then I just got some more chipboard, and there's this little room here where like it comes out of the roof, and the roof, it will have like another bit of roof on top of it. I sort of just estimate a size and shape I like and cut it out and glue that on. And of course add a little roof to that. Going back to my original picture, I had sort of a tower coming out of the top. I decided I didn't want to do that, but I would have sort of a circular roof on top of, like a little tower. So again, I just make that out of cardboard. I make it so I cut the shape of the roof out of two of the sides, so that way it can sit in the middle. And then I get to work on the roof on top of that. To do this, I start with a circle cut out of foam that is the max, the size I want the base of this part to be. And then I just start drawing and cutting out more circles that are, gradually getting smaller and smaller. And then as you can see here, I'm just gluing them all together in one big shape. And then it makes that cone shape. And I stick a skewer through it to keep them in place while I work. But once they're glued, I start shaving off the edges just to get rid of that, jagged, like stair shape from the different pieces of foam and to make it look like one solid piece. And then I glue that on top. And the little tower that it's sitting on top of, I decide to do a different style. So that's going to be all wood. So I just glue little planks of popsicle stick around it. So now I start working on the chimneys. First, I just make one out of cardboard to stick on top of the roof. Then I'm making a larger one to go on the first floor. Now, the chimney on the bottom is going to be more like something you'd see in like a log cabin. At least that's what it makes me think of, where it's just sort of whatever stones were around. So what I do is I cut pieces of foam and glue that together. And then I just, the same way I drew the brick walls earlier, I'm just drawing rocks in this chimney and just looking at reference pictures and making, different sizes and shapes of rocks. Even if, one or two aren't great, there's so many, you're not going to notice it later. And then for the roof chimney, I decide I want it to connect to like another outdoor chimney next to the little porch thing we built. So I make a structure there. Now, before I glue the styrofoam to the cardboard structures, I basically trace them out a little larger and I'm going to make them overlap. So what I do is I draw a brick pattern on all of them, and then instead of cutting a straight line, I cut it overlapping. And you don't really have to do this, but it just makes it, a touch more realistic because you can see the bricks all the way around, and it mimics the way brick corners overlap. And then for the very top of the chimney, I just glue a few pieces of foam board and carve the top one at an angle to be like a chimney cap. And then I just have some little tube bits and I glue them on top. Now it is time for shingles. Yet another time-consuming, tedious process. Not as bad as the others, though. Basically, I've seen this technique in a lot of different places, but a good mix of having the realism of making individual shingles, but also not taking 8 million years, is cutting out strips of cardboard and then cutting shingles, but only don't cut the piece off completely, cut like 3/4 into it, and then you have a single strip of shingles. And then to give it, a little more character, once they're cut out, I sort of just bend them all in different ways to sort of, loosen the cardboard, get it like not broken because I don't want to break the shingles, but like curving up, curving down, just little things that don't match, because the less perfect it is, the more realistic it'll look. And then again, starting from the bottom, I just start gluing them down. Then I decide to do the deck railing, so I just take a bunch of those matchsticks and glue them evenly around the sides. At this point, I decided to finally start what I was maybe most excited for, but also most apprehensive to start: the telescope. I forget if I mentioned it in the beginning, but it was definitely an idea I had early on, and I put it in the sketch. Technique-wise, I was mostly inspired by the amazing Studson Studios. He built a wizard's tower from Stardew Valley, and that also had a big cartoony telescope. So basically what I did was I rolled up a piece of plastic into a conical, telescope shape, and then I wrapped it in tape for a little bit of stability. I still wasn't happy with it, so I ended up gluing a piece of cardboard around it, which made it a little thicker and less flimsy. And then I actually glued another one of those juice carton pull tab things. This didn't have the same look as the other ones. This was just a round curved one, but it was like the right size for a curved lens. So I glued that on the end. And then this big blue bottle cap I have here is going to be another window. So I glue a flat piece of cardboard on it for the telescope to stick out of. And then I'm just adding little decorative bits, some strips of cardboard to be metal, again, some tacky glue dots to be rivets. I decided another thing that will make the telescope look a bit more fantastical is like extra lenses. I was kind of thinking of like the sort of machines you see at an eye doctor's where they like flip in and out and do different magnifications. But I have a bunch of little cardboard circles that came from a board game, like poking out tokens. These were little leftover bits. And I picked out 2 and I just glued them to pieces of paperclip, and I glued that onto the telescope. Then I got working on the Zen garden itself. I didn't want to do this on the building itself, so I cut out a piece of cardboard that was the same size and shape of the Zen garden area I'd made. And then I glue some larger pebbles onto it. And then, looking at some reference pictures, I draw lines around the rocks in the pattern that I want the sand to be. And I actually went through a few versions of this. I forget. I didn't film all of them. I think this is the only one I filmed. Initially, I used hot glue to represent the ridges in the sand, but it ended up being, I don't know, it just didn't work. And I played around with different sands and glues. What I ended up deciding on was using tacky glue to follow the lines in the sand. And then before it had a chance to dry, pouring baking soda on top, because the dirt that I usually use is way too big for that sort of fine sand that you find in a Zen garden, whereas baking soda is very small and fine, so it'll look like much smaller sand. And in a process that took much less time to watch than to actually do, the structure of the building is done. So, finally, it is time to paint. To make a long story short, I thought I could start out by priming the build with a can of spray paint. Yellow is hard to paint. I thought if I got a can of yellow primer, yellow spray paint, we'd be off to a good start. That didn't work. I think something about, I don't know if I got a bad can of spray paint or if it's something about the color that makes it harder to work with. I'm thinking it's something about the color. But basically, I got like halfway through and the can started clogging and basically ended up unusable. So I couldn't paint the whole thing like fully, but it was a good start, better than nothing. So then I just went back to cheap acrylics like I always do, and I just started blocking in the colors. First I did yellow, obviously, because that will be the majority of the building. Then I move on to the other larger things like the roof and the tower. I was debating whether or not to paint the tower, but I decided I wanted it to be, more natural stone, so I go with a gray for that. For the roofs, I had orange initially, but the more I thought about it, I wanted something that would contrast instead of, I guess, blend in more, so I decided to go with blue for most of the roofs? I don't know. And then got some red for the brick wall. And then it was time for all the wood. I think the hardest part about this was, as I've mentioned before, I'm a very messy painter. And since brown is a very dark color, I took great pains to paint cleanly and carefully so I wouldn't get on the yellow, because trying to paint yellow over a dark brown would be a big pain in the butt. Spoiler alert, I still had to clean up some yellow over brown. Then I just go in and start getting different little bits. I paint a lot of bits pink because A, I'm not sure what color I want them to be, but also B, I'm leaning towards, orange and purple accents, and I think a nice vibrant pink under both of those will work well anyway. And also I decided I just liked the color for the, the round shingle wall, so that was going to be pink anyway. Then I go in and get all the metal bits, so the things that are going to be silver I paint gray, the things that are going to be like bronze or copper I paint brown. And then at this point it's just a long, slow process of doing multiple coats of paint, cleaning up, when I paint over something, deciding what bits are going to be orange or purple or other little bits like the door at the porch. I decided to go with like a light blue. I'm just getting, little bits, one thing at a time. Finally, once pretty much everything is, at least base coated, it's time for some dry brushing. So, I get a light blue to go all over the roof, and it really just weathers it. It makes it look old and worn and just gives it a bunch of character. But then I, weather other bits. I have a lighter red. I go with like that same pink to dry brush the bricks, and I don't usually use that color for brick, but I think it came out pretty well, getting a like tan color to dry brush all the wood, and again trying to be careful not to paint over the yellow. The last main thing I had to paint was all the windows. I'm just going to talk about them briefly. I painted them all the same dark blue as the roof to start with, and then what I like to do for windows is I do multiple steps, and you can see here I sort of did one step on each of the windows so you could sort of see a comparison. I just like going in with lighter and lighter shades of blue, eventually ending with a drop of white. And that just sort of mimics like the shine of glass. Although actually I ended up deciding I liked it without the white, so I skipped that step. So at this point, most of the painting was done, so now it was time to work on the decorations. I had in-game, Yavin is kind of a merchant, but like a hoarder. Like the interior is like very crowded and filled with objects, so I wanted the outside to look similar, so I thought, a lot of decorations and little bits and bobs everywhere. So I'd been working on some of them off camera, but it was time to work on some of those. The first thing was I wanted a few banners to be hanging down. When I built the roof earlier, I glued in some flagpoles So I just cut out some pieces of paper and, played around till I found a shape and a size I liked. And then I went to baby wipes. As I mentioned in the last video, I like using baby wipes to represent like fabrics. So I thought it would be a good choice for the flags. If you watched my last video with the Oval Office curtains, you might remember I mentioned that I find it difficult to cut baby wipes. I don't know what it is. There's just something about it. It like pulls apart more than it cuts. So this is where I learned that lesson. Once I ended up painting them, I was able to trim the edges more. So when I cut them out, the edges were like very sort of messy and like it wasn't, like the lines weren't very straight and everything. But once I painted it and it became, firm, I was able to trim it down a little bit and cut off the gross bits to get a nice clean edge. Then I start painting some of the other little bits. I 3D printed a lot of little potion bottles because I figure I'll just, put those all over the place. And then I cut out a lot of small rectangles of chipboard. As I mentioned in the last video, they are basically the perfect size for small scale books. So I just paint those a bunch of different colors for some variety. I decided I wanted the building to have a sign like an old medieval tavern, like hanging wooden sign. So I cut a shape out of chipboard. I painted a dark brown and then I go over it with just some thin lines and a lighter brown to look like wood grain. And then I look through some like medieval style fonts, find one I like, and then I use that as a guide to paint a big ol' yellow Y for Yavin. Another little decoration I thought would be fun were famous paintings. So I decided to do some art forgery. Like I mentioned in the last video, I love and hate making tiny little paintings. These were just painted on pieces of chipboard. I roughly made them the size the actual paintings are. I decided to go with a Mondrian. I don't know if that's how you pronounce it, but like the very geometric red, white, yellow, blue squares. The main thing I wanted was things that were like easily recognizable, and I feel like with the squares, his work definitely falls into that. I did the girl with the pearl earring, Starry Night, and a Monet because as I was building this, I kept thinking to myself, it's a total Monet.
What's a Monet? It's like the paintings, see? From far away it's okay, but up close it's a big old mess.
And really the funniest part of that was I saved painting the Monet for last, and I thought it came out horrible, but then I came back to it like 10 minutes later and like just looking at it not up close, I was like, yeah, that looks like a Monet. So then I get some tape and I mask out some designs on the flags. I decide I want yellow stripes on one, and for the other one I saw some like grid sort of patterns, but not with an actual grid, like with shapes. So I decide I'll do that, but in lieu of any sort of like realistic heraldry, I decided to go with clock hands because I thought that would just look cool. So each little design on there is a different time, and then when I take the tape off, I do a big hourglass in the middle. A simple design, but I'm happy with how it came out. Then I make this little diorama. For a long time, I wore contacts. I don't anymore, thank you LASIK. But the containers they came in were really neat. It's basically a piece of plastic with like literally a little window, a little bubble popping out, and I decided to turn that into a real window for the building. I painted the outside yellow to match the house, and then the edges brown to look like wood. I didn't want to just paint black behind it. I decided to paint like a little scene. Again, similar to the little paintings, I just do like a little doorway and some shelves. And then I glue some of the little potion bottles on the inside, and I glue that to the little background I painted. You want to be careful with clear plastic if you're using super glue because the glue will fog up the plastic. I tried my best to avoid it, but it still fogged up a little bit, so the end result you can't really see through at all, but, you know, it's still a neat little effect, and I'm glad I tried it. I decided I wanted some decorative string lights, so I took a piece of headphone wire, and I just glued tiny silica gel beads to it. I'm not sure if there are different kinds of silica gel beads. I feel like the ones I've had are all pretty much the same. They're like translucent bits of plastic. Without even painting them, they look like little light bulbs, so that worked out perfectly. Since I did a lot of these bits off screen, I decided I would just showcase all the little bits I made. So we've got an umbrella, a beach chair,
a little barber's pole, a clock, some wooden crates, a grill, some garden gnomes, a welcome mat, some flower pots, some classic pink lawn flamingos like I mentioned at the beginning, some gears, a little bird bath, some statues, little teeny tiny birdhouses,
and probably my proudest creation, a big mouth Billy Bass. Surprisingly enough, there are no 3D models for one of these online, so I found a model of a bass, and I made a quick little, plaque shape, and I put them together and 3D printed it. And then we got all the little, potion bottles. Some of them were like tall and thin, so I painted them to look like Coke bottles. And then basically the last thing I have to do is the plant life. I actually got a new product, well, new to me, which is Woodland Scenic's clump foliage. It's kind of similar to the grass flocking and moss I've used before, but this, as its name implies, is more three-dimensional. It's not a flat layer, it's like little clumps. So I take little bits of it and I glue it to all the flower pots. And also I made little cardboard planters to go under the windows, so I glue them on there. And just, wherever I think he'd have plants growing. So along with plants are the fake plants. I decided every, kitschy outdoor space needs one of those fake bright green grass rugs. I was going to try making it, but I had no idea how. So someone actually gave me the idea to look on Etsy, and I found this great miniature grass rug meant for like dollhouse stuff. So I just cut out a few rectangles that would become the carpets, and even at this tiny scale it still felt a little big, so I just went in with scissors and trimmed it a little bit. I ended up just doing sort of a dry brushing with a brighter green to hopefully make it look a little less realistic, and then I glued those in place. The very last thing I did was spraying it with a matte sealer and then covering all the windows in gloss Mod Podge so they would be shiny. And since the clump foliage is a little delicate, I made a 50-50 mix of Elmer's glue and water, and I just sort of covered all the clump foliage in it, and then when that hardened, it just stuck together and sealed it in. So, after all that, after about a month and a half of work, like 36 hours of footage, it's finally done. Let's see it. We've been through 4 different towns in the last week following that dragon, and we've seen this house in every one of them. There's no way somebody built something this crazy in every town. They're identical. How would you even build something like this? Oh, what are you folks doing back so soon? I'm sorry, who are you? Tweet tweet. I'm still Yavin, of course. Are you still you? Did you find the exploding fire flowers already? The what? The exploding fire flowers. Duchess? Tweet tweet. Did you need exploding fire flowers? Don't be ridiculous. You did. What are you talking about? We just got here this afternoon. We don't need any fire flowers. Duchess, when is this? Tweet, 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 tweet. Yes. You probably need more potions. Come in, the door's down below. I mean, yeah, I guess we'll buy some potions while we're here. Open your eyes.
Oh, wow!
Fantastic.
Oh my god! Wait, turn it so we can all see all the
There's a little
signs.
gnome and a little flamingo. Oh, I
Yes.
love it.
Oh,
look
yes.
at the little window.
I know!
There's so many details, Jen.
There's a little birdhouse.
Yes. Oh, that's fine.
Oh, that's so cute.
Oh my
Oh,
god.
the little raccoon.
Awesome.
Oh yeah! Another birdhouse.
Oh, fantastic.
And there you have it. Even though there were a lot of points that were very tedious and like I felt done with it, I'm really glad I powered through and finished it because I'm so happy with it. It's just a joy to look at. Like every time I look at it, I just focus on some different little detail. I don't really have a ton of regrets. One of my friends was asking me if I did or, anything I would change. Not that I would ever make this again. But there's really only two things I would do different if I were doing something like this again. The first one is using a shoebox, just because it's so flimsy that like when I filled it with stuffing, it bowed out a little bit on the sides and the bottom, so it's not perfectly straight. And then the other thing is I probably should have glued each box, each floor together last, because like in particular this area with like these little pink tiles and the Zen garden, that was really hard, like getting my hand in there to do the actual gluing. Part of me knew that would be the case, but also like some of it I didn't think of until after I had started gluing it. Maybe would have glued them all at the very end, but even then neither of those are huge issues, and I'm still really happy with it. I just want to give one more special thanks to our DM Liz. She helped me write the little scene with Yavin, and for being our GM, because if you play role-playing games, it's a lot of work. So thank your GMs. So I hope you enjoyed it, at least half as much as I did. If you want to see what else we're doing, as always, check out the links below, including if you want to support us and make sure we keep doing this kind of thing. But that's it for today. So until next time, be creative, be kind, and take care of yourself.
Oh. How long is that going on for?
Another 12 hours.
If I was Jim, I'd look straight into the camera right now. Okay. Let me get the other light, actually.
And this is a family-friendly